Yeah, I want to talk about this. This would lead to the end of World War II. This is called Operation Barbarossa and the Germans' failure in the Soviet Union. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And this is, says IWM. The Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, they were at one point to have, Stalin and Hitler had a pact, but of course Hitler, hatred of communists, In August 1939, as Europe slid towards another world war, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression treaty. The Nazi-Soviet pact came as a complete surprise to other nations, given the ideological differences between them. No, they had a lot in common. They did. It was differences between the countries. Yeah, they wasn't trying to say these two were different. No, they were on the same page of a lot of things. It ushered in a period of military cooperation which allowed Hitler to ignore Western diplomatic moves and invade Poland. Stalin's forces then attacked from the west and completed the subjugation and partition of the Polish state. For the next year and a half, Germany also benefited economically from the arrangement, with Russia exporting grain and oil in return for manufactured goods. Soviet cooperation allowed Hitler to expand his plans for European domination. In May 1940, the Blitzkrieg rolled westward, and France was conquered in 6 weeks. But peace with Russia would not last. Hitler had always wanted to see Germany expand eastward to gain more living space for its people. After the fall of France, Hitler ordered plans to be drawn up for an invasion of the Soviet Union. He intended to destroy what he saw as Stalin's Jewish Bolshevist regime and establish Nazi hegemony. The conquest and enslavement of the Soviet Union's radically inferior Slavic population would be part of a grand plan of Germination's economic exploitation, lasting well beyond the expected military victory. Regardless of recent economic and political cooperation, the Soviet Union was regarded as the national enemy of Nazi Germany and a key strategic objective. Now, how did that go? Operation Barbarossa. Hold on, give me a second. In December 18, 1940, Hitler issued Führer Directive 21, an order for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The German military plan called for an advance up to the hypothetical line running from the post of Archangel in northern Russia to the port of Akhmim in the Caspian Sea, the so-called A-line. This would bring the bulk of the Soviet population and its economic potential under German control. After 5 weeks delay, while operations in Greece and Yugoslavia were completed, Operation Barbarossa, named after the all-conquering medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, was launched in June 2022 and 41. Over 3.5 million German and other Axis troops attacked along a 1,800-mile front, a total of 148 divisions. 80% of the German army were committed to the enterprise. 80%. That's why Russia won this war. 17 panzer divisions formed into 4 panzer groups, formed the vanguard with 3,400 tanks. They were supported by 2,700 aircraft of the Luftwaffe. It was the largest invasion force to date, and it went disastrous for Hitler. It did. I mean, it caught Russia off guard. The German forces were split into 3 area groups, each with a specific objective. Army Group North was to head through to the Baltic state of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and take Leningrad. Army Group South would attack into the Ukraine toward Kiev and Donbass industrial region between them. The Army Group Center objective was Minsk and then Moscow itself. Hitler expected these all to be attained in approximately 10 weeks. That didn't go well. Soviets had massed large forces on the western frontier, but there were under orders not to provoke Germans. Although mistrust of Hitler, Stalin did not believe that he would attack as soon, despite the ominous German buildup and a stream of intelligence warnings. He had some 5 million men available immediately, and a total of 23,000 tanks. But the Red Army was still unprepared when the Germans struck. The Germans got off to a good start, with the panzer groups quickly pushing towards the objectives and Russian forces falling apart in confusion. They were greatly helped by the Luftwaffe's bombing of Soviet airfields, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. The Germans quickly established air supremacy. On the first day alone, 1,800 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, plunged toward Leningrad with General Heinrich Himmler, Panzer Group 4 in the lead. Russian forces in this sector were thinly spread, and the panzers covered 500 miles. That's 804 kilometers in 3 weeks. By mid-July, they were only 60 miles, 96 from their objective. Like I said, this did not go well for Hitler. It backfired. Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, or is that Bach? I think it's Bock. Also made rapid progress. By June the 28th, Panzer Group 2, led by General Heinz Gruden and General Hyman Holtz, Panzer Group 3, had encircled 3 Russian armies and captured over 320,000 men in the Minsk pockets. The 2 panzer groups then pressed ahead, linking up on the far side of this month, on July the 22nd, in another double development. 2 more Russian armies were trapped and destroyed. Another 300,000 troops taken prisoner. Army Group South under Field Marshal Gerd von Run, I'm having trouble with these German names, had the furthest to go, and his attacks also faced the stiffest Soviet resistance. Most of the Russian army armor was on the front, but by early July, von Run had pushed out beyond the pre-1939 Polish front. General Heinrich Eberwald von, God, these names are long, Panzer Group 1 was slowed by Soviet flanks attacks as it headed for Kiev, or whatever they call it, the capital of Ukraine, and key to the coal-rich Donetsk basin. On August 8th, the Germans surrounded two Soviet armies, capturing 100,000 men in the Uman pocket, and reached the Dnipro River. The naval port of Odessa on the Black Sea was also besieged. Up to this point, all seemed to be going well, the only major problem being time needed for the infantry to catch up to the Panzer and mop up pockets of Russian defense. But Soviet resistance was now stiffening. Despite catastrophic losses, a German settlement around southeast of Somalia was recaptured in a costly but successful counterattack. Meanwhile, Army Group Center supply situation was becoming critical. Hitler decided to halt the advance on Moscow and reinforce Army Groups North and South. Holt's Panzer Group 3 was sent north to support and divide on Leningrad, while his tanks were dispatched to help Army Group South take Kiev. The German High Command protested vigorously. The panzers were only 220 miles from Moscow. Hitler regarded the resource-rich Ukraine as more important. On August 20th, he ordered that the conquest of Crimea and the Donetsk basin be given priority. This was his downfall. So he didn't choose winter, he chose summer. The Soviets were completely fooled by German moves. 5 Soviet armies were trapped in a vast silent around Kiev. As usual, Stalin refused to sanction a withdrawal before the pocket was sealed. By the end of the September, Kiev had fallen, and over 650,000 Russian troops killed or captured. The Germans pushed along the Black Sea coast and into the Crimea, laying siege to Sevastopol. In October, Kharkov fell, but by now the Germans were exhausted. The fighting had severely depleted their tanks, and supply lines were stretched to the line. For now, the southern front stayed where it was. In the north, too, German forces had reached their limit. In September, with the aid of their Finnish allies, they cut Leningrad from the rest of Russia, but lacked the strength to take the city. Instead, Hitler ordered it to be starved into submission. The epic siege would last 809 days. The battle for Moscow. Hitler now decided to resume the battle for Moscow. On October the 2nd, he unleashed the Operation Typhoon. He believed the Russians had been fatally weakened and lacked the strength to defend the capital. One more push would see it fall and victory would be his, but the Red Army had been reinforced. Almost a million Soviet troops were in place. Although they had few tanks and aircraft left, a multi-layer ring of defenses had been thrown around the capital, and its citizens had been mobilized. The German offensive was carried out by a reinforced Army Group Centra comprised 3 infantry armies and 3 panzer groups. 1 million men and 1,700 tanks. However, the Luftwaffe was weak, and after over 3 months of sustained operation, and the weather was beginning to turn. Once again, the initial assault was successful. The Panzer Division stormed ahead, and over 6,000 Russian soldiers were captured, and in 2 more huge encirclements near the cities of Bryansk and I'm not going to pronounce those. The Russians were down to about 90 men, 900,000 men, but as they reached the approaches to Moscow, the German formation slowed to a crawl. Autumn rains had turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. It was the Rasputis, the quagmire season, and the wheels and horse-drawn transportation became hopelessly stuck. The Germans chose to temporarily halt operations. This is where things changed. In the mid-November, with the temperatures dropping and the ground now frozen hard, the Panzer attempted a final pincer attack around Moscow itself. The delay had given the Soviets time to bring in further reinforcements, including reservists and troops from Serbia. Oh no, that's Siberia, and the eastern borders. The northern German pincer was almost successful and got within 12 miles of the city. German officers could see the Kremlin building, and through their field glasses, the Germans also tried attacking in the center along the Minsk-Moscow road on December the 2nd. A Renaissance unit got within 5 miles of Moscow, though Tantum close. This was the limit of the entire advance. The depleted German units were exhausted and frozen in inactivity in the deep snow. On December the 5th, the Soviet launched the surprise counteroffensive. The Germans were forced into retreat despite Hitler's calls to defend every foot of ground. Germanian and several other senior generals who advised withdrawal were sacked. The Russians succeeded in crushing various German formations and encirclements of their own. The Luftwaffe struggled to operate but performed vital work, ferrying supplies to cut off units and hurrying the Russian advance army. The Army Group Center was pushed back up to 150 miles from Moscow. A furious Hitler dismissed Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Field Marshal Walter von forget trying to pronounce that German last name, and appointed himself in his place. This is, you want to know what really ended the war? It was this. Yeah. Watch the invasion unfold. Yeah, you can. Why Operation Barbarossa failed? Operation Barbarossa had clearly failed. Despite the serious losses inflicted on the Red Army and extensive territorial gains, the mission to completely destroy Soviet fighting power and force a capitulation was not achieved. One of the most important reasons for this was poor strategic planning. The Germans had no satisfying long-term plan for the invasion. They mistakenly assumed that the campaign would be a short one, and that the Soviets would give in after suffering the the shock of massive initial defeats. Hitler had assured the high command that we have only to kick the front door and the whole rotting would come tumbling down. But Russia was not France. The shock value of the initial blitzkrieg was dissipated by the vast distances, logistical difficulties, and Soviet troops and numbers, all of which caused additional losses of German forces, which could not be subsumed. Yeah. And the fact that this went on in the winter, the impact of Hitler's involvement. Hitler's impact, his invading Russia was the stupidest move ever. Hitler's input had been heavily criticized, not least by his generals at the time. Moscow was always a more important objective to the German high command than it was to Hitler, who was more concerned with destroying Soviet field armies than capturing the industrial resources. His switching of the main thrust from the center front to Leningrad in the north and Ukraine to the south was an extent indeed. The division actually worked in the Germans' favor since it surprised the Soviets and resulted in the destruction of huge Soviet forces around Kiev, but it also threw away Germany's only real chance of outright victory. The early capture of Moscow would have had an undeniable psychological impact and may have been the tipping point. In particular, believe that using the panzers in traditional encirclement battles played into Russia's hands and gave them chances to bring forward fresh reserves. He had advocated an all-out drive on the capital, but when Hitler assumed the assault with Operation Typhoon, it was too late. The German army was now fatally weakened, and the weather had worsened the Soviet reinforcement army. So this is, they failed to, so you can read the rest of it. I just want to do a quick video on this. This is Gilgamesh. I will talk to you later. Bye.